very recently you basically created a wheelchair for D&D. And not just a regular wheelchair, a battle wheelchair, which is super exciting. Can you tell me a little bit about the battle wheelchair?
Yeah, it was a little project that started about 6 months ago. And then because I was studying my final year at university, so I'd like study about wheelchairs and wheelchair sports in my spare time between like my degree. And it's basically built to be able to withstand combat, be durable enough for combat. Basically, if you've ever seen wheelchair BMXing, it's kind of like that. It's built, to enable a disabled player essentially to do anything that the able-bodied player can do. It's meant to be like a sort of leveling of the playing field, rather than giving a disabled character like an overt benefit that makes them better than an abled person. It's just meant to level the playing field. It's just been lots of fun to write and play around with, and figure out the mechanics for it and how it would work in D&D with combat mechanics and things like that. And I'm currently writing some new upgrades for it that are all magical things that you can have done to the chair and things like that. So yeah, it's just fun.
And certainly there was some negative response, but it does feel like overwhelmingly positive response as well. I think everyone was very excited to see this, especially for D&D.
It originally I put it out in like it was more of a concept kind of form, and I had wheelchair using D&D players make characters with those rulings and then tell me what reflects the chair, what doesn't exactly work, what isn't like their experience, and kind of built and worked off that. And then I brought out the one that recently got brought out, which is the version 2.0, and that's like all the feedback has been put into that very clean cut rulings on it, and it got a lot of negative reviews and things on places like Facebook and stuff, and I got some very unsavory DMs at points. Like my first experience having made something for D&D and getting overt death threats for something. But since people like Matt, Mark Holmes, Dan Dillon stepped in and was like, hey, no, like this should be in D&D. Like the community has really like come together and like banded over it to stop the people who are essentially at their core like making ableist arguments for why it can't exist in a game where magic and dragons exist, but a wheelchair shouldn't, which makes no sense. It has been now like kind of overwhelming support. There's like the odd one or two, which I'm always happy to shut down on Twitter and tell them why their opinion is wrong of why a chair can't exist. But for the most part, people have been overwhelmingly supportive. It's quite amazing.
But for both of you, like how often do you run into like this issue when it comes to like tabletop and D&D and fantasy, or even people making the table literally like both in-game and out of game more accessible, like understanding like how should dungeon masters, how should players, how should the community be more welcoming to these things? Because it's strange to me because and I brought up myself, wheelchairs existed since the 5th century, right? Like a chair with wheels at least has existed. So this is not a new thing.
Yeah.
So I don't understand. I'm genuinely shocked that anyone would have a problem with this to be in their game.
Well, I can't say that I run into such issues very often. As a wheelchair user, I'm in fact quite agile and I dodge. But I think some of the reason why there is such pushback is, of course, straightforwardly ableism from prejudice, but also ableism as a product of media. When we look at D&D, it is unquestionably fantastical and mythic in its origins, but it is also aesthetically a pseudo-historical Europe, like a pseudo-medieval Europe. in vibe. And a lot of this realism question that seems so outlandish in a fantasy game seems to me to be a product of, when's the last time you saw wheelchairs that made any sense in depictions of not fantasy Europe, but medieval Europe? That when people draw on the historical aesthetic in Dungeons and Dragons, what they draw on is a history where they haven't seen disabled people, where the knowledge of when a wheelchair was invented is not broadly known fact, because disabled history isn't taught and because we don't see it in historical media. So this reflexive pushback is, at least in part, because it is in conflict with media everybody already knows, all of their existing facts, their existing preconceptions of what this is supposed to look like. And the way to fix this is that we actually show more of it throughout, everywhere. And then it removes the notion that, well, that wheelchairs are some weird exception, that we aren't part of society or part of fantasies or part of history, because in fact we are. And that these exist in different forms, and frankly, letting go a little bit of the pseudo-medieval European aesthetic and broadening that notion will also prevent it from being incoherent with one's immersion. Because it's those assumptions that make this so weird. And in so many games, to answer your question a little more directly, I don't play with GMs who come in with those assumptions. I come in with people who are looking at this firstly as a fantasy product, not as a pseudo-historical product.
It is funny, like in the world, and we've all been talking about this, in a world where we have mechanical beholders that can like dig through the earth, and submarines and modrons and artificers and turrets that walk around and shoot fire with, you know, we've got iron golems and everything else with all the magic in the universe. The fact that a wheelchair would stand out is very odd. But yeah, that's a product of not having like books with concept art, of showing people who are disabled as adventurers. That's a product of films never doing it, on virtually never doing it. I can't be 100% sure, but I as far as like the zeitgeist of for popular culture, probably the first time they ever saw someone in a wheelchair in a medieval fantasy setting was probably Game of Thrones, and that person also didn't get around a lot. They just, you know, they didn't show an example of what could be. What are a lot of these arguments that you hear? Because I hear a lot of these high fantasy arguments about, well, healing or just floating around on Tensor's disk or something like that. And it's a more complicated question and answer than that.
The most common one is, well, doesn't restoration, you know, negate disability, because it negates paralysis, but what they elect to forget is it negates the paralysis effect, which is caused by a spell or by something that is put on top of a player during combat or during a game. Whereas if your character was born disabled, you can't just undo that. And regeneration spells as well, they're always like, you can just grow the arm back, and it's like, but well, if you were born without your arm, it's never been there to begin with, you can't regrow something that was never there. And when because I had a great one today, sorry, and it was starting off with that argument, and as I kept shutting it down and saying, hey, look, you just, you know, you're reading, only picking out the stuff in the rules that supports your argument and neglecting to ignore everything else. And well, one guy just went, well, they couldn't get into dungeons because the doors aren't big enough. And I was like, every map has a 5-foot wide door, like, and the chair doesn't make the character become a size larger. What's going on? And, you know, furbolgs, orcs, half orcs and stuff can still get in to a dungeon. So a person on a wheelchair is like too far. which is just ridiculous. And when I pointed that out, and everyone was like, hey, no, maps say that the doors are usually 5 foot wide or bigger, usually bigger because, you know, the big bad guy wants to impress the players and show how like evil he is usually, that he just like instantly didn't respond and just blocked me. And it's like, you know, I give you genuine answers for your questions, and it's there's a choice to either accept it or just ignore it. And a lot of people I've met in the TTRPG community outside the sphere of the work that I do, and outside of my disabled friends, are of that mindset that you know, because D&D is such a high fantasy setting, that therefore it's improbable that a disabled person could exist, but they elect to ignore that there are poor people who can't afford certain magics, that seventh level spell regeneration requires a 13th level cleric to cast it, and there aren't many of those around. And it's bizarre, and these arguments only come up when somebody puts in something that is good representation or enables disabled people to see themselves. These arguments keep coming up time and time again, and like I have, you know, had the same argument with people like 5 times in a day, because they keep asking the same thing but electing to ignore anything that's been said. And with my combat wheelchair, people were like, well, what about stairs? And it's like, well, it's very clear that you didn't read the PDF because the PDF accounted for stairs. And then they were like, well, dispel magic. And I was like, but it's not a magic item, and dispel magic doesn't affect magical items. It only casts away spells or objects that have spells cast upon them. And I don't know, it's kind of bizarre, the lengths that people will go to and the kind of mental gymnastics that they will do just to say that they don't want disabled people in their games. And at the end of the day, the product I've made is entirely optional. You don't ever have to use it. It's there for the people, you know, who wanted that representation and wanted to play characters like themselves.
And at the end of the day, it's just, well, I want to play this character.
Yeah.
So why, like, this is my choice. Like, my D&D does not destroy your D&D. There's no situation where what I do at my table is going to destroy your table. It's just it's a very silly argument, top to bottom. Also, boy, any building built in like in the 1920s and earlier didn't have a 5-foot gap in the doors. So dungeons are more accessible than most buildings in the real world. I
would like to live in a dungeon, please. Yes.
Yeah. You know, of course. Who wouldn't? It's just so convenient. What have you encountered along these same lines, Sam?
I mean, fundamentally, these kind of objections are bad faith, where reason is slave to the passions, where there is a pre-assumption that this is not a thing that they want, and they will find ways in a game to say, we couldn't. And in fact, speculative fiction very broadly is often used as a lever of disability eliminationism. It's no different than you see in utopian sci-fi where medicine has somehow advanced to the point that disabled people don't exist. That in the case of D&D, that mechanism is high fantasy. And that is the core with which we contend. But fundamentally, when people make these arguments, they're simply failing at the game side of things as well. That, as Sara points out, this is an optional product, meaning that this would be a situation where a player would go to a GM, say, I want to do this, and a GM who is generous of heart and good of spirit finds the way that their D&D world is made such that this player concept can exist. And if you are not doing that, yes, there is clearly an ableist prejudice, but more universally, that is a bad GM move. That is a bad fellow player move. Find the way that your player can be in that world. It's really very simple. So when people don't, it's bad faith. All of their rationalizations are bad faith and bad manner, and it's unfortunate, but it means that there's likewise a very simple path to inclusion. You figure it out. Sara has offered no small number of ways to figure it out if it somehow breaks your sense of simulationism or verisimilitude. It's there, and this exists so that players can do something. And we want D&D to be that place. So we will.
You also shouldn't have to make the argument. You shouldn't have to spend the time explaining why. Like, it should be, I would like to do this thing. And then it should be the DM who figures it out, especially with something like this. It's also like part of identity too. Like it's not. I think DMs have to be very wary of that stuff. If you have to understand, if someone wants to play this type of character, that's part of that character. Like, why are you fighting so hard against me playing a character this way? I've played characters that have had all kinds of like magical curses and stuff that could never be broken. Like, how it's strange that we can't have like something that's a very realistic thing that affects who you are. Like, not only in real life, but the character itself. It's just how you want to play that character. What is your advice to DMs when in incorporating a wheelchair or trying to avoid ableism? Because a lot of that is, as you said, Sam, sort of baked into how we've consumed like fantasy culture, because we don't see that representation.
I think a lot of it is be prepared to be wrong and be prepared to be told by people when you're wrong and that something is ableist, and don't argue against it. Just say, okay, well, how can I improve and it won't happen again? And, move on and learn from it. Whereas, it's a lot of it as well is if you want to use something like the combat wheelchair and you really are uncertain, is there are plenty of resources out there by disabled people, by wheelchair users who run blogs, or they do vlogs, or they, are in news articles and journalism, and they write about their experiences. So you'll be able to read about them and learn things about them. And there are plenty of PDFs out there for free on how you can avoid ableist language or avoid using ableist terms to describe something. It's all there at your fingertips. But I think a lot of people just don't make the connection that they could use something like that in a fantasy game, where you definitely can, because the only limit really is your creativity and how you go about it. I just fully encourage people to use the chair, even if it's not something a PC wants to use. Maybe make an NPC, because then you're already adding a variety of people that are represented in your game. Like I said, just always be open to critique about it, and people telling you if you are wrong about something that you said or something that you portrayed, and keep a good community, a good conversation open with your players. Especially like if it's a player who is playing a disabled character, or if they are disabled themselves, you can open up that dialogue with them and talk to them about it.
What are some tropes that people can avoid? Because that's another issue. Like the very tired trope of the villain who has been hurt or disfigured, etc., etc., etc. Like now I am the villain. Darth Vader is a very classical example of like, a man who has lost all limbs and is evil. Like it's something we've seen over and over again since probably Captain Hook, or well beyond that, or pirates with peg legs and all this other crap that has been, again, baked into a lot of the fantasy and the stories that we read. There has been an association, particularly in the 80s, with having any kind of disability somehow informs your desire to become a villain.
I think it's not to say that like you should avoid the trope of a disabled villain, but if you want to make a villain disabled, that's absolutely fine. Just don't make it their driving force. That's why they became evil, and that's why that's why they do bad things, is because they're disabled. Because, you know, there are disabled people out there who are, you know, bad people or not very nice people, and to say otherwise is silly. But there are also more than capable disabled people who have jobs and get on with their daily lives, and you don't see that a lot. Is just, you know, disabled people having jobs, going to work, and just doing the things everybody else does throughout their day. And as well as the big trope I ask people to please not do is make it that the character is, or the person who's disabled is used as inspiration porn, and is used in a way that the players are helping them, because aren't we good people who want to help this poor, sad, disabled person? And that's a big trope in fantasy, I've noticed, and it's been a big trope in some D&D games I've actually played in. And when I've called out on it, they've gone, I didn't even realize that it could be taken that way. And it's like, yeah, because, you know, you're able-bodied and you've not experienced it yourself. But there are some great resources out there written by disabled people on inspiration porn and how to avoid it. There are also some excellent bad TV episodes that are excellent examples of how to not do it. There's some really good ones out there on YouTube and stuff. And like, yeah, like I highly recommend, you know, putting that kind of information that you have at your fingertips into use.
A lot of times when a GM is looking to be more inclusive of their players or simply of the world, it is often very well-meaning and nonetheless GMing from a place of fear, a very reasonable fear of not wanting to get it wrong and not wanting to hurt people, which should absolutely motivate the kind of research that Sara is talking about. But also, I strongly recommend going and watching a Paralympic Championship murder ball game, watching the murder ball documentary, watching Aaron Fotheringham, and remembering that these are about GM tools, and the GM toolbox is part of this here. Develop your language of description. Get a sense of the effervescence of being in that crowd, watching someone smash into someone, hearing the resounding ring. Listen to what murder ball players say, because if you can't tell, that wheelchair rugby is a sport that I came from, one that lives in my body, and there is something incredibly powerful about ramming into someone and feeling none of the pain of the hit, just the ring of it through your chair up into your body, which is exactly the kind of thing that a GM will use to describe in action. That if you want to GM for these things, do the same things that you would do for GMing anything else, just as you might watch fight scenes for inspiration or take in a particularly cinematographically beautiful scene in order to describe it. Develop your GM language, and then it's not just from a place of being afraid to screw it up. You have something that you positively want to convey. And your player, if they're in this, probably also has something that they want to do with this character. Because I know usually when I'm playing a disabled character, it's because there's something I want to say about that experience. So, like you do for any other player, be a vehicle for what they want to do. Listen to them from that. Get excited about the thing that they want to do, because that is when I see my GMs flourish. I've had a lot of GMs who, over years of working together, have not only gotten comfortable and less afraid of screwing up and just coming from that eggshells mindset when portraying disabled people, which comes from such a respectful place, but it doesn't feel great. But over time, by finding ways to get excited about telling these stories, by becoming co-conspirators, it is a way not just to facilitate making disabled players' experiences rad and facilitating cool stories, but it makes you a co-conspirator. And that is what we want. That is what I want. I want this combat wheelchair to excite people the way that it excites so many disabled players. And so throw yourself into disabled culture and disabled media, because it does exist, and in fact, it is rad. Wheelchair rugby should be on ESPN. Hello and welcome to the hill I pushed up so hard so I could die on it. It's exciting stuff. This is not just something where you need to be worried you'll get it wrong and avoiding things. This is also something to be actively embraced because it makes the world rad and it makes your stories more rad. And I'm so excited for anyone who is interested in getting into it. It's a treat.
Yeah, exactly. That's so well said. I mean, that's the thing, is like, it's not about you letting someone use the wheelchair. Be excited that a character is going to be using the wheelchair. I mean, a barbarian in a wheelchair is amazing. There's amazing art that Sara has gone for the wheelchair, and people have started making miniatures as well. And it's just really cool. I don't know how you don't go down the dark road of making a soul coin wheelchair hell engine eventually. But
go on.
Yes, I would go full Mad Max on this. But like, that's the thing, especially like in Artificer class, the infusions you could put on that chair, right? You know, as like, say, the armorer or something like that. Like, you could do some absolutely amazing fun things. And I think if you're a dungeon master or a GM, this is an opportunity for you to do something really cool and something that you probably very likely haven't explored in your mind before in creating adventures and stories and everything else. And that player is going to bring so much to the table that you are not going to expect. And that's what's great about D&D and tabletop in general, is you get to explore these spaces you may never have explored before and challenge yourself in ways that you maybe have never considered. What do you want to talk briefly, Sara, or a little bit about the art that you got? Because you did get a ton of really cool art.
Yeah, I got a ton of cool art. I got art from Claudio Posas, who has done art for the D&D 5th edition books before. And he provided one that's like an old-fashioned, like, advanced Dungeons and Dragons piece of art that's on the original tweet. And he's also produced a version that's more for, like, if it were in you know, a D&D book, the kind of style it is now version. And each one is different. One's been kitted out for a crossbow knight, and the other has been just like the basic chair in its basic form. Not that long ago, but half an hour ago now, there is someone who made a wheelchair for a character in VR, in 3D VR, and has made it, and it looks really cool. And it has, what is it, bathroom ramp, wheel spikes, and all the storage for their books and scrolls. It's a wizard character, a human wizard, and there have also been pieces of art about other people's characters who are using it. There's been a half-elf caster bard, and people who are playing around with barbarians in the chair, the barbarians just charging into battle on these chairs. And yeah, there's some people as well who've reached out with miniatures that they've designed as well, and all of them are like for different classes. There's a really nice one at the minute that's in the works of a druid using it, and the chair is made out of wood and rocks and leaves, and it looks like basically a living plant. And it has, my favorite bit is it has a little perch for their owl companion, their owl to sit on it, which I really love. Yeah, there's some great ones, and on my end I'm making a class now, a subclass for the rogue, that is based on the combat wheelchair, and it's going to be for WCX, which is like BMXing for wheelchairs. I'm doing that actually based on Aaron, who Sam mentioned earlier. Yeah, based on him and his work. And it's going to be, you know, all about strength and dexterity and using the chair as not only a weapon, but like as a means of sneaking around and infiltrating places and things like that. And it'll come up with its own little quirky upgrades for it that when you level up, you get access to.
We don't have footsteps. We're low to the ground. We are perfect rogues. We have no biped problems. It's great.
That's so cool. Oh my god.
Finally, I like rogues. I got excited.
No. I was watching the excitement build. What does it feel like to have inspired so many people by the creation of this? I know there's been a lot of negativity. Yeah. But there has been, I feel like just an overwhelming amount of support and positivity has resulted because of this. And you've gotten so many other people excited, and people are making art, and people are now feeling, I think probably because of you, more open to be asking their dungeon masters and their GMs, hey, I want to play this character.
Yeah, there's been some really touching messages actually that I got the other day. One was from someone who felt that they never could play D&D, and now they feel that they can because they can play someone who's like them. There is someone who was talking about DMing for their young nephew, their 10-year-old nephew, I think, and he threw the chair into like a combat scene with an NPC, and immediately their nephew ran downstairs to tell his niece, his sister, that there was a wheelchair in D&D because she herself uses a wheelchair, and now her niece is now come and like joined in on the group and is playing as a combat wheelchair using character. There was people who were talking about how they've had to retire characters because they took injuries, and D&D didn't really accommodate rules wise for their characters to continue adventuring. And I got a really nice message not that long ago about someone who is bringing their character out of retirement now because the combat wheelchair exists. So he's a barbarian, and I think he broke his back, and now he can use the wheelchair to continue fighting and going on adventures with his old party. So yeah, it's been really lovely. Like the support for it has been when it's been there and been in my messages and my emails and stuff. It's always been very touching, and yeah, just knowing that I've made D&D a little bit more accessible for people is overwhelming, but like a really good kind of overwhelming. And yeah, it makes any kind of hate that I get from it completely worth it, because the people I made it for are loving it, and they want to play it and they enjoy it. And at the end of the day, to me, that's all that really matters. Like anybody who hates on it because they don't want disabled people in their games, that's up to them. They can carry on with their day, but the people who it was meant to mean something to, it means something to, and I'm happy to have contributed positively to their experience of D&D.
Where can people find it?
Oh, you can actually find it. It's gonna stay as the pinned tweet on my Twitter at Mustangs Art for like ages now. And it goes through into a Google Doc. There is a version that looks like, if it were in the books kind of layout. And there's another version that is dyslexic friendly. It's an open dyslexic friendly font. And once I've figured out, all the little things that I'm going to change and any additions that are going to come in, I am going to make an audio file version so that not just hard of hearing, but like also blind folks or people who have reading disabilities or have problems reading can listen to it instead. But I didn't want to make like a million files, because each one gets updated every now and then. So I was like, I'll do it once everything's a bit more finalized. But yeah, people can find it there on my Twitter. Yeah, it's completely free as well, and yeah, like, so you don't have to pay for it, and you can use it. So